I drove from North Dakota to South Dakota, stopping to take a photo of the Welcome to South Dakota sign. When I crossed into South Dakota, I thought, yes, I only have one more state to go, Alaska, to complete the set. The following year, I did make it to Alaska and was able to check that, the last of the states, off my bucket list. Even if Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. become states in my lifetime, I'll still be covered because I've been to both of them. My GPS directed me down some country roads that were gravel, and after my mishap in Glacier National Park, I was driving well below the speed limit to try to avoid any problems and another blowout of a tire. I had heard of Wall Drug forever, like south of the border in the Carolinas. Their billboards start hundreds of miles away. I am staying in the town of Wall, the closest place to Badlands National Park, but by the time I had visited the park and finished dinner, the drugstore, Wall Drug, was already closed, as it was every day I was in Wall, so I never saw the inside of the famous drugstore. But I did see the giant carved rabbit in Wall. Well, in the area, as when I was that close to Little Bighorn, I'll save that visit for another episode, I wanted to stop at Wounded Knee. When I saw the sign for a Minuteman missile site, I thought it would also be interesting to go there, to be able to go from the Indian Wars to the Cold War in one day, but I pulled up to the missile site, I saw it was closed. So I continued on to Wounded Knee. It made for an incredible day that started with tears of sorrow and ended with tears of joy. I had asked a ranger at Badlands National Park about the Wounded Knee Museum, and he had confirmed it was permanently closed after the COVID lockdown. He also told me there was nothing to see at Wounded Knee, just one sign in a cemetery. He said he wouldn't waste his time going there. But I knew I wanted to go anyway in spite of the 2-hour drive. I didn't know when I might be back this close, and I was rewarded with some early morning bison sightings as I drove through Badlands National Park. And the route took me through the bizarre little ghost town of scenic South Dakota. It looked frozen in 1888, except for the satellite dishes and .com on some of the abandoned stores. I had wanted to visit Wounded Knee and the Pine Ridge Reservation since I had read Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee when I was a teenager. It has haunted me ever since. Every American should read it, but be prepared to be physically and emotionally upset for a long time after. It still haunts me. It not only covers the barbarity committed by the U.S. cavalry at Wounded Knee, but many, many other horrific actions against the Native Americans. And yet the whites called those people savages? The photos of the bodies of the Indians left in the snow are still etched in my memory. When I visited the mass grave on the hill above the massacre site, I had to weep for what happened. But like visiting Auschwitz, I felt it was a place I had to see once. As I walked through the massacre site, I thought I heard the haunting sounds of war whoops. Hee-hee-hi, hi-hi. I don't believe in ghosts or spirits, so I was sure it was just the wind. But then it came again and again. I was both relieved and disappointed somehow to discover it was a very worldly source. When I went to another cemetery, at a school across the way from that cemetery, 3 kids on swings were doing the chants. Whether in a joking or sincere way, it was impossible to tell, but it did add a poignant soundtrack to my already emotional visit to Wounded Knee. I was glad I had the massacre site to myself for a half hour or so to reflect and grieve. Before anyone else was around, I was able to study the site and walk down into the ravine where the women had carried their children, thinking it offered some cover from the fire of the Hotchkiss guns, a small, light cannon that could fire rapidly, so the effect was sort of an early machine gun. The soldiers had set this gun up to mow down anyone in the way of their bullets. But once in the ravine, these terrified women and children became easy targets for the soldiers who stood on the edge of the ravine taking target practice at the unarmed people below. No exact count was ever made, but the death toll was believed to be between 200 and 300. At first, the government tried to claim Wounded Knee was a, quote, battle, but Chief Bigfoot and his band of Lakota had already surrendered and turned in their weapons days earlier, and they had camped where the Army had ordered them to camp. The Army clearly meant to destroy this small band of Indians. They set up the machine gun on a hill overlooking the encampment. The Indians had very few weapons left, so most of the soldiers who died of bullet wounds were killed by the Army's own, quote, friendly fire. This was late December, and there's a lot of snow on the ground, and it was very cold. The bodies of the slaughtered were left in the snow, many frozen in grotesque postures in which they fell. It took a long time to gather the bodies and bury them in a mass grave up the hill. This was 1890, and the so-called Indian Wars were supposed to be over, so there was some public outcry when word of this massacre made its way to the nation's capital. The resulting investigation led the government to conclude that the soldiers who took on this barely armed band of indigenous people who had already surrendered were actually heroes, and many more medals were awarded to these soldiers, including 18 medals of honor. The whole thing is sickening. I was staring in horror at the sight when a car pulled in next to mine. An indigenous man got out. He was the same man who had tried to sell me a dream catcher at a viewpoint in the parking lot at Badlands National Park the day before. At the time, I told him I didn't have cash, but in the meantime, I had remembered I did have a little extra emergency cash stashed in my wallet. He approached me, and I told him we had talked the day before, although he didn't remember me. He said he would be happy to tell me his people's side of the story of Wounded Knee if I would tip him. I told him I didn't have much cash, but I did scrounge around and got some coins from the center console of my car and a few other dollars, and I gave him all of the $16.75 I had. I asked him if he was Lakota, and he said yes, Ogallala Lakota. He thanked me for not using the term Sioux, which only that summer I had learned that many Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota people find offensive. It was what their enemies, the Crow, had called them. He said he was born and raised on the reservation, born at the Pine Ridge Reservation Hospital a few miles south, and he had lived there all of his 37 years. I was shocked at his age. I would have guessed he was well past 60. Clearly, life had not been kind to him. He walked with a bad limp, and his hands were so twisted up he dropped some of the money when I paid him, and I had to pick it up and give it to him again. A man I met in the cemetery a few minutes later also had noticeable physical issues, and a few of the people I saw walking around the area also had handicap. The first man I met pointed out his trailer on a hill nearby. As on the Wind River Reservation I had visited in Wyoming, the poverty and desperation hangs in the air. I had visited Wind River with a young friend with whom I had worked in Grand Teton, and he wept when he saw it. He had never seen such a sad place and remarked that the indigenous people are still paying the price for being in the way of the white man's quote-unquote progress. The Lakota man and I talked for quite a while. He seemed happy to talk about his people, and he had ancestors who had died in that ravine. He told me he doesn't like the sign that gives information about the massacre. He said it looks like it was done by a fourth grader. The printing, the word choice, everything. The way a child would not plan well enough and have to bunch up the words at the end of lines. That someone could have to spray back to indicate the story is continuing on the other side of the sign was also sort of childish. I couldn't disagree with any of his objections. It seems to me that the state of South Dakota or the U.S. government should properly mark and commemorate this sad chapter of American history. After we talked and he filled me in on a few things, he gave me a dream catcher, one of the same ones he was selling for $20 each in Badlands the day before. Although it was certainly not my goal to try to get a deal on the tour of the Dreamcatcher, it worked out that way because I got both for $16.75, which was all the cash I had on me. I had noticed a folding table there, and apparently he and others from the area did sell items there. Before I left, he told me about the sign down the road that marked the spot of the surrender of Chief Bigfoot. I had somehow missed it as I drove by, so I was glad he gave me better directions and I was able to find it on the way back. He also pointed to a cemetery at the top of the hill where he said there was a memorial marking the mass grave of the victims of the massacre. He also pointed to the cemetery at the top of the hill where he said there was a memorial marking the mass grave of the victims of the massacre. He also said his friend up there would be happy to show me around in exchange for a tip. I thanked the man and drove up the hill as far as I dared go without risking getting my car stuck in the rutted dirt road. As I walked the rest of the way to the cemetery, I found a weathered and faded dollar bill in the weeds and picked it up. I still had it in my hand when I was approached by the indigenous man in the cemetery. I told him I was sorry I didn't have any cash, that I had given it all to his colleague down the hill, but I held out the dollar and told him I had just found it, and it didn't feel right to take money from this land anyway. He accepted the dollar, but was definitely disappointed that I didn't have more to offer him. He said he was a single father and needed gas money for his truck to go round up his horses that had gotten out. Indeed, as I drove through the town, there were horses standing in the road. I drove very slowly, honking my horn. The last thing I wanted to do was hit one of his horses. The man told me if I had any questions to ask, he'd be sitting by his ancestor's grave. He introduced himself as Bear Eagle, and I noticed that name on several of the gravestones nearby. He thanked me for visiting and for my interest in their history. I walked around the cemetery for a while. The number of infants and number of young men who died in their teens, 20s, and 30s was striking. I have to wonder what kind of health care they got. And the poverty is evident in the housing, the cars they were driving, their clothes, and even the gravestones. Ordinarily, I would find piles of poop in a cemetery offensive, but seeing bison droppings somehow seemed appropriate. It seemed like a good thing that the animal whose near extinction led to the near extinction of these people had come to visit their resting places. There was also a prairie dog town in one of the cemeteries, which also seemed appropriate somehow. In the cemeteries, I found the names and numbers of veterans interesting. In Pine Ridge, I was also struck by the number of Lakota who were killed in World War II. They died serving the army that had killed so many of their ancestors not that long earlier. It was a very moving visit. I had lunch in Pine Ridge and then headed back to Badlands. Once back in Badlands National Park, I finally saw the bighorn sheep for which I had been searching for so long. That will be covered in another installment of Walt's Wanderings. It was a full day of emotions at both ends of the spectrums. Tears at the horrible happenings at Wounded Knee, and then joy at seeing bighorn sheep finally in Badlands National Park. Have you ever visited a place that made you cry? Would you? Tell me about it in the comments, and I'll see you next time on Walt's Wanderings.